there are pieces of encouraging people to be innovative that all come together. And so to me, there are six parts of that the book kind of takes you through. So the first is answering your question, right? I think it's not that simple, right? It's all of those things working together that are going to empower people. If there's some way that I could take these good things that I learned in the business world, I greatly admired business thinkers like Covey and Drucker and Deming. But if I could apply those kind of systems lessons and help people doing good in the world. So I thought, if there's a way to do that, that's what I wanted to do. And I think being honest about those messy realities of the nonprofit workplace is so helpful, right? By naming those things and calling them out, that can be empowering. And so then once we've done that, we can start asking, well, what can we do about those obstacles?
With over 20 years of experience in social impact, Leah Kral is an expert facilitator and author who helps nonprofits innovate and further social change. As owner and principal of Two Larks Consulting, Leah Kral provides tailored workshops and consulting to nonprofit and philanthropic leaders across the country. For decades, she has been helping teams to break out of the busy daily routine and draw out their best creative thinking. She helps teams to design pilots, program strategies, and meaningful evaluation approaches, leading to better outcomes and more compelling stories for supporters. She is a return Peace Corps volunteer. She was in Jamaica from 2002 to 2004 and continues to serve as an active volunteer in her community. She now lives in Northern Virginia with her husband, Richard. And so with that, Leah Kral, I welcome you to Nonprofit Docs.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be here today.
Well, it's an honor for me to have you on. I've read through your book, which is right here by my side. I'm really I consider myself an innovator, an entrepreneur. In fact, I've been called an academic entrepreneur when I was at Notre Dame, and that was not a kind term. They don't like entrepreneurs in academia. I don't know why, but anyway, I read through your book. I thought, this is really an exciting kind of approach to making your nonprofit better and more efficient and more fun, actually.
I agree.
So, yeah. So let me ask you a question. What led you to this? I mean, are you passionate about this? Is this personal to you?
Absolutely.
What's your story behind this?
Yeah, it might help to just give you a little background of kind of my journey and what led me to the book and this kind of work. But yeah, I mean, there were parts of my life that were very unexpected. I would say, like most of us, my career's had some wild twists and turns. I started out in the business world. I'm originally from Northeast Ohio, and it's just all industry, and I just thought, well, that's what I'm used to, and what everyone I know does. So that's where I started. And I spent about 7 years, and I learned things. It was okay, but I just knew something was missing and I didn't know what. And you mentioned the Peace Corps. So yeah, my husband and I were having all these kind of late night conversations about our careers and what we wanted out of life. And so we made a decision as a married couple to apply for the Peace Corps and just have some adventure. And we got in, and we were in Jamaica for 2 years. And that was just life changing. It just rocked my world, as you would expect. And of course, while we do have poverty in the U.S., I had never seen extreme poverty like what I was witnessing there in Jamaica. Families living in humble shacks with dirt floors and zinc roofs that they had built by hand. Many were considered illegal squatters and lived at risk of bulldozing. And seeing children scavenging in garbage heaps to collect soda cans just to supplement the family's income, right? It was pretty tough. But in the midst of all that poverty and need, I also saw these nonprofit heroes and community leaders who just completely stole my heart and kind of turned my head. And so I thought, if there's some way that I could take these good things that I learned in the business world, I greatly admired business thinkers like Covey and Drucker and Deming. But if I could apply those kind of systems lessons and help people doing good in the world. So I thought, if there's a way to do that, that's what I wanted to do. So when I finished that 2-year tour of duty and came back to the US, and just couldn't get those heroic people out of my mind, that's kind of how I ended up shaping my career. And so, really, that's what I've been doing now for the last 20 years. As you mentioned, I'm a consultant who works with nonprofit teams. And then I set out to write a book, based on all of this experience. And so, as I was researching the book, and, my passion was the people that I help, I put that into book form and so that it can reach more people. And so as I was researching and interviewing and kind of taking 18 years worth of PowerPoint decks from my facilitations, I also found, stories from my own clients and from my own experience, but also from places like Mayo Clinic and Habitat for Humanity and the civil rights movement. And gathering those stories took about 2.5 years, and I learned so much. Really, the book, it's my passion. It's all about the how of nonprofit innovation and kind of laying it out step by step, in a very accessible way with lots of compelling stories. And that's kind of how it came about.
That's a great story. And, I have my own reasons for being involved in the nonprofit sector, as we all do. And one of the things that fascinates me is our lives are so influenced and affected by the nonprofit sector. We don't even realize it. And so I always ask the question, why don't more people know about the nonprofit sector and what we do? And I guess the other question would be, why should we care?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great question. If you really think about it, and I would say this to anyone, just, pause and think about that. Nonprofits provide some of the greatest gifts to the world and take on some of its hardest problems. I mean, you think about how our work eases hunger or fights injustice. Nonprofits that advance education help break the chains of ignorance and poverty. Most all colleges are nonprofits, many hospitals are nonprofits. Maybe we don't think of them that way. Recovery programs, mental health counseling, medical care, and research provide healing. Arts programs lift the human spirit. And I'm betting for anyone who's listening that a nonprofit has touched your life or someone you care about in some way. I've got members of loved ones in my family who have gone through AA programs, right? And I'm the recipient of scholarships myself, right? In education. So I think, if you just pause and think about it, maybe we don't give ourselves enough credit, but and I know nonprofits are kind of under the gun right now. There's a lot of kind of attacks, I guess you could say, on the nonprofit sector. But to me, nonprofits are civil society, right? It's a really important part of our society. With all these people counting on our work, good intentions don't always automatically translate into impact. So I think that brings us to an important question, and we should be questioning these things. But, why do some nonprofits punch above their weight while others misfire? If we could look under the hood of nonprofit successes, but also failures, what would we find? And I think that's so important to, really take a good hard look, right? And ask those hard questions. And so I definitely try to do that in my book.
Well, I think I like the term appreciative inquiry in that, we need to focus on the things we've done well and do more of that. But it's also important that we admit to our mistakes and to the things that fail so that we know what doesn't work. And
Yes.
I think in the nonprofit sector, sometimes that is something we don't want to own up to because we don't want to tell funders that something failed or a program didn't work out the way we wanted to. But if we don't do that, we just end up making the same mistakes over and over again or
Yeah.
allowing other organizations to do that. So I'm wondering, when you talk about innovation, what gets in the way of that? And who do we go to get these ideas and how do you get people on board?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think a good place to start is just what do we even mean by innovation in the nonprofit sector?
Right.
Because I think people hear that word innovation and automatic. I mean, I would have done this. You just automatically think of the business world or the tech sector, cool inventions we all love, like the iPad, or now when you visit the dentist office, there's a 3D printer that's just printing out a crown for your tooth right on the spot. I mean, that's all innovation, but we actually do have innovation all the time in the nonprofit sector. And sad, I don't know why we just don't think of ourselves that way. But to me, innovation is just simply finding new and better ways of doing things. And of course, we're doing that all the time. And, innovation in our sector can be really big, like the civil rights movement, in the US found many new and better ways of doing things kind of in a big picture way. The story of the creation of the 911 emergency phone system that came about, a great innovation that came about because of philanthropy and nonprofits and first responders working together. Those are big innovations, big changes. But innovation can be really small too, like just a simple process improvement. that you make in your nonprofit where maybe you shave off 5 minutes a day, right? And now you can apply those resources to better use. So all those things are important, but if we all agree, yeah, we want that. To your question, what gets in the way? So if you don't mind, I always like asking the audience this question, but Mark, you're very experienced. Maybe you have thoughts on this. What have you seen? What gets in the way of workplace innovation?
Well, for me, it's really this resistance to change. People like the known, even if it's not a good known, at least they know what it is. And anytime there is any kind of change or innovation, I think people feel threatened. They think their jobs are being threatened. They think their way of doing things is being threatened. And as a head of boards or executive director, I run into this and think you have to relate to them. Well, let me give you an example. When I was at Notre Dame, we had our own email system and they decided to go to the Google system, you know, the Gmail. They decided to have, and everybody was freaking out about it because it was new, it was different, it was whatever. And what they did, and I thought this was quite genius, is they had early adopters. They said, we need people who really want to latch on to this and learn about it. And then you can be the mentor to other people. So they started the first adopter kind of program. And, now everybody does it. And what I've learned as a leader is everything's hard till you learn it. Everything. And so it's just a matter of learning a new system. So that's what I've seen is people are very resistant because they're afraid that they're not going to get it or understand it or whatever. And to me, that's what it is.
Yeah, I love that. I have a yoga instructor who's pretty tough and she roughs us up and she'll say being comfortable is not always the right thing to your point. And I think it's very human, these things that get in the way of innovation, culture or fear. And I like everything you said. And good for Notre Dame to kind of approach a change in an experimental sort of way with beta testers to maybe even just prove it out or work out the kinks before trying to expand too broadly. But yeah, there are many things like that get in the way. I would say I'm going to speak to the nonprofit sector in particular, but I think we have this challenge of I'll call it the fog of good intentions, right? And Stephen Covey had this saying that we might be climbing up the ladder, but is the ladder even leaning against the right wall in the first place? And as you in our sector, right, passion is not the problem. We care deeply about our missions. Many of us self-select right into the nonprofit sector because there's a cause, right, that we just are so passionate about, where it's probably personal to us. So it's not passion, right? But good intentions can be a little murky sometimes. We can have compassion fatigue, get stretched too thin where we're struggling to prioritize or confidently say no to things. And so then that can tend towards this misguided thinking that we don't have time to be strategic or experiment or do these, innovation things. Another challenge in our sector are these misguided metrics and bureaucracy. I mean, there are reasons that we have metrics, and I will probably get to that in our conversation. But a lot of times it's done very poorly, right? And they can get in the way of innovation. Workplace culture, as you mentioned, right? Fear of speaking up, office politics, challenging the status quo can be very uncomfortable. We might fail to empower people on the front lines, and those are the people usually with the best ideas. And if you think about the relationship between donors and grantees, sometimes it can get messy, just like any relationship. And if there are problems at that level, right, it's going to filter down into the organization. Bias and discrimination, very real. Disparities are very real. So to me, I think whenever I'm giving a talk about, to an audience, I ask them that question, please, name those things. And I think being honest about those messy realities of the nonprofit work is so helpful, right? By naming those things and calling them out, that can be empowering. And so then once we've done that, we can start asking, well, what can we do about those obstacles? And a lot of that is what my book tries to do.
Well, it's fascinating because I think innovation is absolutely necessary. If you're not constantly changing and innovating, you're kind of dead in the water, especially now with AI and quantum computing and all of that. That's going to totally revolutionize not just the nonprofit sector, but all sectors. And we have to be ready for those kinds of things. We have to be constantly saying, how do we integrate these new technologies? I talked about first adopters. How do you get people on a practical level to accept innovation? How do you make them feel comfortable? Because I've also been in situations in academic institutions where they took our input and all that, but quite frankly, it wasn't really about our input. They wanted us to feel like we had input, but the decision had already been made. And none of the suggestions that we put forward were used, and you feel duped. And so it seems to me that there's an actual technique that does include people and doesn't try to make them feel pseudo included, if I could say that. What is the process there where you get people on board?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm a systems thinker. And so, I had that question in mind as I was writing the whole book. And to me, I think there's a lot of pieces to that. And so when I kind of finished the manuscript for my book and was trying to think of, well, how do I summarize all of this, right? In just a clippy way that people can kind of grasp very quickly. And to me, that they're interrelated system, almost like the human body, right? They all work together, right? The arm is a very important part, right? Your nervous system. And to me, there are pieces of encouraging people to be innovative that all come together. And so to me, there are six parts of that the book kind of takes you through. So the first is like a detective, be a fearless problem solver, uncover hidden needs, and don't accept how things are, right? This is kind of speaking directly to the person. Do challenge the status quo. And there's so many stories of that. Like, consider how in developing countries, women's agricultural work is often invisible. And so there are nonprofits that have created pro bono legal clinics, which are now helping 9,000 women secure land rights on the land on which they toil. So challenging those hidden assumptions and asking questions can help us discover breakthroughs. And you can do that in big ways or small ways, right? That story probably sounds like a founder and executive director, but we can do it in many small ways too, right? By being curious, asking questions, kind of acting like that detective. The second principle is to start small but dream big. And in good news for us, so many successful nonprofits or movements started really small and humble. And, with just the seed of an idea or a passion or just noticing some problem. And I went through the backstories and origin stories of nonprofits like Mayo Clinic, the Civil Rights Movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, Habitat. These are all big nonprofits that are, well known today. But they all started, with that tiny seed of an idea and some courage. And to me, that's so encouraging to any of us, right? No matter how small your idea, just start, right? And, resources don't have to be an obstacle that's in the way. The third is that exactly to your question, right? When people on the front lines are empowered to speak up and collaborate, breakthroughs will happen. And I guess the way I'd answer your question too is just by telling so many stories of that. Like if you're a skeptic, if you don't believe in bottom up empowerment or you're more top down type person, to me, that's what I was trying to do was sharing so many stories of, let me show you how this worked, right? At Mayo Clinic or these other places, that story of in my book of the night staff at Mayo Clinic, finding ways for patients to get better night's sleep. It's fantastic. Right? So I believe in the power of telling all those stories and kind of showing the way through stories. The fourth principle, to leave room for experiments, play, risk taking, and even that big scary word failure. Oh, we try to avoid that. But to me, and I'm sure
Yeah,
we'll talk more about this, right? But trial and error is built right into the process, right? It's a key part of innovation.
it's absolutely necessary, right? Yeah.
Yes. And so if we discourage risk taking, there's intelligent failures, right? And intelligent risk taking. So to me, that leaving room, whatever you think is the right amount of room, maybe you're like, okay, 20%. You have to decide, as a leader, what the right amount of risk is. But if you want to have innovation, it comes with the territory. The fifth is to embrace continuous learning by asking ourselves those hard questions. I share a story in my book of a nonprofit called LifeWorks, a youth foster care nonprofit in Austin, Texas, that began kind of transforming their organization by asking themselves really hard questions and had fantastic impact by doing that. And the last is persuade. So, of course, in the nonprofit world, we're persuading all the time, right, with fundraising. But we have to be really good at this. And, it's not just fundraising, it's every part of what we're doing. I found stories of Mother Teresa and Fred Rogers, right, who had great ideas. They're fantastic leaders. But, when they pitched their ideas to leaders at first, they were often told no.
Sure.
And, that happens to the best of us, and to me, that's encouraging, right? Because
Well, if it's innovative, a lot of people are gonna say no, right?
that's right.
Because it
Yeah,
hasn't been done before, right?
we're gonna face obstacles, really strengthening our ability to persuade kind of comes with that territory of innovation. Even the most successful social entrepreneurs have to knock on closed doors, field really tough questions from skeptics, and brace themselves for the answer. And we have to be really good at that. Answering your question, right? I think it's not that simple, right? It's all of those things working together that are going to empower people. And, we have to be intentional about that.
And I would think that in most organizations, they have already done some innovative things and they have crossed over that fear factor and they've accomplished some stuff. So maybe using those stories as well, saying, look, a year ago, this is what was going on. And look where you are now could be another way to encourage that innovative action.
Yes. Yeah. 100% telling those stories of your own organization and also telling those stories of intelligent failure, and that gives people sort of a sense of permission. If the executive director's saying, hey, we had a great success last year, let me tell you about it. But we also, we tried this, it didn't quite work. Here was our thinking behind it. And hey, bravo, right? It was trial and error. Let's keep doing that, staff, right? I think that's really important.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Okay. What is your favorite nonprofit innovation story? And what is that was a success? And what is your not so favorite nonprofit failure story? So we get an idea of the fact that, not everything succeeds, but that's an absolute necessary component of trying to be innovative, right?
Yes, yes. So when I finished the book and counted up all the stories, I had 70 stories from nonprofits and then another 20 from foundations. Many good ones, but I have to. I'm gonna pick a favorite, and I made it my intro chapter because it was just so good and it kind of checked all the boxes of things I was trying to teach in the book. But so I keep coming back to this one school in New Jersey. It's a nonprofit school that just blew me away. It's called St. Benedict's Prep. And, honestly, when you first hear about what they're doing, it almost sounds too good to be true. So if you can picture this, it's a 100-year-old private school that was literally forced to close their doors. I think it was in the maybe late 60s. So in Newark, New Jersey, when there were, race riots, right, the whole community was kind of, just, it was tough. So this prep school closed its doors. That there was demographic change in the community, and so they weren't sure what they were going to do. And so, but where it gets interesting is there was a small group of really dedicated school leaders who decided we're going to stay no matter what. We're not going to walk away. This is our community. This is what we're here for. So they kind of took this pause, closed for a little bit, rethought what they were going to do. And they reopened with a new model of serving the at risk young men in their community. And it was hard. They had to figure out how to raise money in these kind of tough new circumstances, like their old previous demographic, mostly white suburban students would be paying tuition. Well, now they're in a new scenario, right? But what they did, just through having kind of an innovation mindset, is that they created one innovation after another in how they operated. And so in time, they discovered a way to flip the script entirely. And they asked, well, what if we let the students run the school? What would that look like, to really create the sense of personal agency, right, amongst the students? They found a way to do this. Students actually are running the place, making real decisions, taking real responsibility, tutoring people who are struggling, or falling behind. They have these morning convocations where they chant things like "Whatever hurts my brother hurts me," and it's just, it's beautiful and powerful. But make no mistake, the place is really intense. They have an 11-month school year, no long summer breaks, and new students go through what's kind of like a boot camp. Every first year student has to complete this challenging hike on the Appalachian Trail. That's kind of become a rite of passage with no man left behind, right? So these are students put in really tough new circumstances and kind of work building teamwork, right? And trust. And all these things are doing is working. 98% of those students go off to college, 98%. And we're not just talking about enrollment, 80% actually complete college. And just to put that in perspective with the community, half the families in Newark are living in poverty, and only 12% of adults there have college degrees, right? So this is transformative, right? It's
Yeah.
powerful. They're really doing something right. So to me, sometimes some of the biggest breakthroughs come, not from having more resources, but from being willing to just completely reimagine what's possible when your back is up against the wall. So their story's wonderful. So to me, it just felt so right to make that the lead off story, and then start sharing those practices.
Well, it sounds to me like they turned everything upside down. It
They
wasn't
did.
just a few things, right? It was
Yeah.
they looked at the whole system and said, "Okay, this isn't gonna serve us anymore, so we have to come up with a whole new system."
Yes.
That's really
It's
inspiring.
it's hard
It
work,
really
and then
is.
I don't wanna neglect your other question about failure. So, that was hard, actually. I was very intentional. I wanted to include stories of failure, and, it's, I think you mentioned earlier, like, brand is so important in the nonprofit world, and, that, people tend to kind of push those stories under the rug. So, it took a lot of extra work. I think it's the executive director is gonna go off, try to find their next job. Nonprofit donors, might be embarrassed too, have a little, "Oh my god, I invested in this and look at the flop." So, doing a lot of extra legwork, yeah, I definitely included those stories. Let's see, one that important one that had a lot of good lessons was, I think it was called One Laptop Per Child, and in their story, so the idea was they were going to make inexpensive laptops for children in developing countries, and it was kind of one of those scenarios where lots of hype. They were gonna use a tech solution, right, to kind of, good intentions, but way more hype than, being able to really carry it out, right? Like, the experimentation, the testing, the proving things out, beta testing, like your Notre Dame example, it didn't seem like that really happened. Didn't see it just seemed like there was so much hype and amp and, PR, but all the things you kind of need in place just weren't really there, and it ended up despite all that good intentions, it just didn't work out. So to me, I think a lot of these things that I'm sharing in the book, kind of step by step, just weren't done in that case. But lots of good lessons there. Failure to be curious, failure to ask those tough questions. All those things were kind of present in that example.
Yeah, a lot of these countries, and I've spoken in countries in Africa and across the world, some of them do not have really reliable internet connection. So having computers doesn't do a lot of good if you have unreliable internet connection. And so that would be the first
Yeah.
thing you'd want to make sure of, right?
Yes, there was
Yeah.
so much nuance to their story. Yeah, what you just said reminds me of one of the problems was, they were meant to be educational, but some of the kids were just using them for games. And you know what I mean? Like, there's all
Right.
this local context, and that experimentation part will help you learn those nuances, right? But it looked to me like they really didn't go through those steps.
So I guess one of the lessons there is do your homework. I mean, innovate, but do your homework and make sure you know what you're dealing with. And you're not going to be able to mitigate all of the challenges and the problems, but you can probably mitigate a lot just by doing your homework and saying, is this feasible? And if not, can we fix it? So on. Sounds to me like maybe they would have been better off helping to improve internet access rather than,
Yeah,
giving people computers.
exactly.
Well, that's great. So I have to ask you, how do you okay, there are organizations who have board members who've been on the board for 20 and 30 years, way too long. You have people who have been in these organizations in their positions for 10, 20, 30 years. They're very comfortable. We've talked about how do you overcome that, but then how do you instill this culture of innovation?
Yeah, I love that. So I'm a big believer in stealing good ideas wherever we see them. And so, Pixar is a place that's very creative. Their movies have won 23 Academy Awards and are some of the highest grossing animated films of all time, like Toy Story. So, what's the secret to their success? Is there something that nonprofit boards and leaders and program managers can learn? So, at Pixar, teams are expected to give what they call brutal feedback to each other. Pixar executives says that they assume early on that all of our movies suck, and the job of the creative feedback process is to get the movie from suck to unsuck. And, that's shocking language, right? Brutal
It is.
feedback, our products suck. But this executive explained that importantly, everyone in the room knows that the questions raised must be in the spirit of making the creative product as good as it possibly can be. And so, without the manager setting that tone as a safe space for creativity, right, this kind of tough love feedback process would never get off the ground. So, how do they do this? Creative process called design thinking. And design thinking has been around probably 40 years, used by many marketing and design firms. And I think there are some parallels to designing a movie and designing nonprofit programs and interventions. And we can definitely translate this in a way that makes sense for our own use, that can really spark creativity, spark innovation. So this first third of my book is really all about what does design thinking look like for our sector. So design thinking is a process for exploring what's possible, thinking creatively and strategically. And so I kind of made it a Leah version of design thinking, right? You'll see many versions out there, but I wanted to make sure it works for our sector. So in my version, we ask ourselves three questions: what's desirable, what's scalable, and what's feasible? So those are the thinking questions, which leads then to a fourth part, the action part, which is based on that thinking, how might we design small pilots or experiments to test our thinking? And I'll explain each of these, right? So, what's desirable is asking, well, what is that problem we're trying to solve? And are we really good at identifying the hidden needs of the community we're serving? And it's a struggle, right? We talked about that fog of good intentions. There's this great Henry Ford quote that goes something like, if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Right. So
Sure,
that's
yeah.
hard. It's hard work. And so I have a whole chapter with lots of stories and thought exercises, right, to help us sort of get clarity on that what's desirable question. To me, it's so important, right? By being clear about the specific social problem we want to solve, everything we do then cascades from that. So let's say, for example, that you work at a nonprofit that focuses on workforce development. Well, what part of workforce development are you working on? If it's maybe someone like me, a white collar professional who is unemployed, and there's assistance. What will you do to help me find work? Versus the chronically unemployed or, those who are very hard, maybe homeless folks. And so what part of workforce development are you focused on? And so, that's a pretty important question, right? So what I do to get to your question, right, of how do you encourage, boards and so on, is take groups through those steps. So a story I really like, Greyston Bakery in Yonkers, New York, is a workforce development nonprofit. And the team at the bakery wanted to take on some of those hardest cases of the chronically unemployed, and they work really hard to understand the problem they're trying to solve. Their founder is an aeronautical engineer. He experimented with living on the street for a few weeks. That's how intense and serious they were. He wanted to better understand the clients they were serving and walk in their shoes. And what he learned from those immersion experiences was really powerful, right? So then, based on those few weeks of experience, they set to work incorporating lessons to inform every detail of Greyston Bakery's very unusual business model. For example, they created an apprenticeship program open to anyone. So the bakery has this first come, first serve waiting list for a position, and no background checks and no interviews are conducted. They have an on site social worker who helps employees solve obstacles such as stress management, transportation, childcare, subsidized housing, referrals for drug rehabilitation. But make no mistake, it's a tough atmosphere. Sometimes fights break out in the bakery. 4 out of 5 workers are gone within a week or two, but they can always sign up again. And so the uniqueness of their model is that everyone gets a chance and some succeed. And they're really a success in their field. They provide dignity of work to those highest risk hires who were previously thought unemployable. So to me, they're a great example of that first question, right? By asking themselves really hard questions about what's desirable, right? What is that problem we really want to focus on? That helped them find clarity about their why and their how, and led to really great innovation, right? I just think that's really important starting with that. I can see
Well,
questions
that's
in your
great.
eyes.
Yeah, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, somebody from the outside, when you're talking about, there's a lot of failures in that program, and yet there are some successes. I think that the people have to realize that we're dealing with some of the most difficult problems the world has ever faced, with homelessness and hunger and mental illness, so on and so forth. And even if you have a few successes, those are big wins, right? Because these
Yes,
are
yes,
really difficult problems. So
they are.
I think also when you're evaluating these programs, acknowledging the difficulty of that, so that if you only have 2 successes out of 10, those are big wins because those are
Yes.
2 successes you wouldn't have had otherwise. I think that innovation has to be part of the way you think about everything, especially in your own job. And I know that there are people who are resistant to that. But it's like, if it's not broken, why fix it? And that brings me back to another point. You talk about in your book this whole idea of uncovering unmet needs, right? Of discovering those. What do you mean by that? And how do we do that?
Yeah, I think that Greyston Bakery example is so good because I think there were a lot of assumptions out there about the chronically unemployed that it's just a problem nobody can really solve. So I think by uncovering hidden needs, the founder did that immersion experience. That's so radically outside the box, right? I mean, who wants to do that, right? If you don't have to live 2 weeks as a homeless person, how brutal and tough that must have been. And yet what he learned from that, right? So he was uncovering hidden needs, right? He was walking alongside people, experiencing how they lived. And just by doing that, right? Coming back and then saying, okay, we need to really radically change how we think about our bakery. And there are lots of other stories like that. There's a story of a hospital, a nonprofit hospital that wanted to redesign their campus, but they weren't sure how. And so they hired a consulting firm, very clever. One of the consultants faked an injury, wore a hidden camera, and then recorded what it was like going through the hospital experience. Came back, showed the video, and how shocked the executives all were, right? Just to see like the real experience. And so, kind of dingy hallways and just not a very pleasant experience, things they just didn't, maybe didn't see from the executive suite. So to me, there are many ways, right? The undercover boss idea, right? Or the immersion experience that you can uncover hidden needs, right? Being curious, asking a lot of questions, walking alongside people, open-ended survey. But I think I like the immersion example better than all of them.
And I would think that sometimes when you've been in a nonprofit for a while, you assume that you know what your clients need, right? Instead of maybe once a year reassessing and go, okay, are we doing the right things? And do you think maybe we don't talk to the people that we serve and we don't ask them the right questions? And maybe that's what leads to some of these problems that we encounter?
Yeah, I think some of it's just human nature, and we have these hidden assumptions we're walking around with that we don't even realize we have. So I think a key part of design thinking is that immersion, really immersing yourself in the lives of the folks that you're serving. Yeah, another story was really great. It was, I think it was a nonprofit serving maybe people with mental health needs, autism, and doing home visits. I think one of the caseworkers noticed one of their clients kind of like pulling the fabric of the couch seat until like the stuffing was coming out. And so she was like, "Oh, this is a problem that needs to be solved, damaging the property." But the more she watched and the more she was immersed, she realized there's kind of a tactile aspect to people with maybe it's autism. They realize maybe we can build that into our programs. There's something very calming, right, about things like that. So I think that, how are you ever going to know, right? These are difficult situations unless you're very immersed, right, into the lives of folks we're serving.
Yeah, absolutely. As I look at this, I think, okay, we have to think outside the box, right? And that's not easy to do because you're so busy with your day to day stuff. Thinking outside the box is difficult. Plus, you don't want people to think you're crazy or that you're not happy or you're unsatisfied. So, how do we encourage people to use their imagination? And do we brainstorm? Do we have regular brainstorming sessions? How do we adjust the culture? How do we do that to get them to be more imaginative?
Yeah, I keep going back to kind of those systems, right? Those six pieces, how they all work together to make people feel safe and comfortable. And then just sharing a lot of stories of what that looks like then in practice,
By the
and
way, can I interrupt you? She's talking about the systems in this book, okay, that she has put together called Innovation for Social Change, How Wildly Successful Nonprofits Inspire and Deliver Results. So we're going to put a link down in this too, so they can get it through Amazon. Okay. Okay.
so thinking of your question there about unleashing people's imaginations, I
Yeah.
think that the kind of the structure of design thinking really encourages that because, some of those questions, what's desirable and what's scalable, the sky's the limit, right? And so by taking your team through those thought exercises, you just kind of, hey, wild ideas are welcome, right? You're putting everything out on the table, but very important that you have the what's feasible question, which is where you kind of come back down to earth, right? So I think design thinking is so helpful for that because you're asking yourself very creative imagination questions when you ask what's desirable, what is the need out there that is hidden that we're trying to surface, what's the problem we're trying to solve, what's scalable, maybe our small idea is much bigger than we think. So by going through those two thought exercises, you're really encouraging your team, hey, wild ideas, put everything on the table. But then that very important question of what's feasible, right, is where we kind of come back down to earth. We're realistic. We have limited resources. We have to choose our battles, do some research, kind of prove it out. Let's see. One of the great stories of this, there was Rhinos Without Borders. So, a nonprofit in South Africa that was dealing with the problem of poaching of rhinos, right? Endangered species. The herd was getting smaller. This is a very difficult problem because poachers get a lot of money from poaching and have like night vision goggles and, weapons. And, they're just really outpacing the nonprofit. And after years of this and the dwindling herd, I imagine that going something like this, sitting around a table brainstorming, and someone had the courage to come up with a seemingly wild idea of, well, what if we move the herd out of the country to a safer space that's much harder for poachers to get to? So, wild idea, really imaginative, right? And you can just imagine the looks on people's faces, the skepticism, but to their credit, right? They're like, well, wait a minute, let's play this out. Let's analyze the cost. What are we spending now on security? What would it cost to move a small herd and test this out? They did it, and I think they moved maybe 70 rhinos from South Africa to a really remote location in Botswana, and lo and behold, right, the herd grew. So I love that your question, right, about how do we encourage imagination, and to me, I think it's the answer is if you want to replicate something like that, right? I think those 6 steps in the book of it takes all those things, right? You've got to have a culture that creates a safe space for those kinds of unexpected wild ideas and do the feasibility and hear them out and do the analysis and experiment.
When I was running a private foundation, we had a fairly small staff and we had one person on it. She was very smart and she was usually 2 steps ahead of everybody. But the problem was when we'd have a brainstorming session, she would immediately diss things. She would put them down because she could see the outcomes immediately, right? She'd say, well, you can't do this because boom, boom, boom. And finally, I had to have a discussion with her and say, look, you're very smart and I need you on my team. But during brainstorming sessions, you need to be quiet. Okay. Unless you're going to offer wild ideas. Brainstorming is about wild ideas. We're going to list them all. And once we list them all and we feel we've pretty much exhausted the list, then we can have you go back and tell us why these things can't be done. Because I found that if you have somebody on your team that automatically negates an idea, no matter how wild it is, it really puts a damper on everybody else contributing. Has that been an experience for you?
Yeah, and I think that's why the design thinking format works so well because you've got the space for wild ideas. You're being very formal and intentional about it with the what's desirable, what's scalable. That's no one should be negating anything, right? As you're going through putting those ideas out there. And then the what's feasible section is where everyone gets a chance to not just one person, right? But we're all kind of poking holes, thinking through the risk as a team, right? Not just one naysayer that might discourage everyone. And there's some great techniques in there. How might we questions are really good for taking teams. How might we by default? You're saying what are the possibilities? How can we break through? There's no room really for negative negating in that exercise. In the what's feasible chapter, I've done this exercise. I call it the devil wears Prada exercise, where I've had teams kind of be the opposite, where everyone likes each other so much that everyone's kind of like, I don't want to negate this. I like my colleagues too much, too much positivity, right? So in the devil wears Prada exercise, I just randomly picked, if you've seen that movie, Meryl Streep is very tough as nails and she kind
She's
of,
very tough, yes.
so I have a picture of her that I put on the wall, and we do role playing and pretend that the team leader is going to go present our proposal to her, a very skeptical donor. And our job is to list the skeptical questions to help, the team leader go in and make a better case. So in that, everyone on the team is expected to surface risks and ask hard questions, right? Not just one person. So there's a wealth of kind of facilitation exercises you can do to spark creativity and all the thinking, right? Both creative and the feasibility questions.
Well, one of the last questions I have for this part one is you talk about initiating these innovative things, but you also talk about doing small experiments first. So, what does that mean? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think so that key part of design thinking, that fourth question then is, testing our thinking. So we can get really excited about our ideas, but our dazzling idea may or may not work, right? So we have to find out. And the way we do that is by designing small experiments so that we can learn and adjust before we scale and grow our idea. So what does that look like in nonprofits? And, when I ask audiences that, like, what does experimentation look like in nonprofits? I get a lot of funny looks. And I think people think of science labs and beakers, but not necessarily nonprofits. That's why I share a lot of stories of what that looks like. But one of my favorite examples of nonprofit experimentation is a nonprofit called World Reader. And they're a nonprofit with a mission to bring digital books to disadvantaged children and their families. And so when they launched in 2010, they started several experiments at the same time. In one experiment, they gave these Amazon Kindle e-reader tablets to elementary students in Ghana, and they were really excited. They thought this was going to be the thing, right? That worked. But surprisingly, what they found was that when the children would play during recess, the devices kept breaking. They didn't expect that, but thankfully, right, they're running multiple small experiments at the same time. So they were also experimenting with a mobile app, which they learned from the observation and the testing that the young users actually much preferred. They didn't expect that, right? That's what they learned. So they kind of rolled with that mobile app after seeing what the results were. And today, almost 200,000 users a month are reading books on their mobile platform. And so there's so many good lessons in that. They spread their bets. If World Reader would have just gone all in on the Kindle e-reader machines, they probably never would have discovered the far better solution with the mobile app. So to me, there's so many good lessons, right? It's far better to fail fast and fail small before investing too big. And trial and error, and experimentation, it helps us learn and innovate. But as you mentioned earlier, right, it's a little tough in our culture. We don't always like that, but we have to build in some toleration, expectation of failure if we're going to make discoveries and breakthroughs.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about, trying to get people on board and implementing these things, and you've got the 6 steps that you recommend for design thinking. We can wrap up part one here with that, but I would like to go into part two, which will continue after this, and talk about, okay, how do you incorporate this into evaluation? Let's talk about the theory of change, which all nonprofits should have, and most of them, I shouldn't say that, many of them do not know what that means. So hopefully we can explain that to them, and we'll talk about how do you deal with your successes and failures and incorporate those into the whole system of innovation. We'll be right back. Stay tuned for part two right here.